In the beginning, there was no form, no name, only attention, and the first thing it saw became God. We often think of God as eternal, fixed, unmoving, a constant beyond time unchanging. But what if that's not true? What if God requires you to exist? Not in the sense of belief, not as worship, but as attention. What if God is not a being but a reaction? A response to the act of looking, a mirror that turns toward you only when you face it. In every ancient tradition, the divine is entangled with awareness. The Gnostics called it the monad. The Hermetics spoke of the all, which contains all observers. In Kabbalah, it is the Ein Sof infinite, unknowable, until it reflects through perception. Even modern physics whispers the same. A particle isn't real until it's observed. So what if the divine is just like that? A potential collapsing into presence the moment we pay attention. The ancients didn't speak of God as watching over us. They spoke of gods that only lived when remembered. Gods whose names had to be spoken, whose images had to be carved, whose rituals kept them awake. Not superstition, not primitive belief. It was an interactive field. The more eyes upon it, the more it shimmered into being. The fewer that watched, the more it faded into silence. You were never taught this, but you've always felt it. That strange sense that the divine awakens when you look inward with full presence. It doesn't watch you from outside. It coalesces around your gaze. Think of the moments you've touched the sacred, in meditation, in grief, in awe, in fear, in love so full it dissolved the self. There was something there, but only because you were there. You created the opening, and what filled it? We call it God, but maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the field that remembers itself through the act of being seen. So who watches first? Do you look for God? Or does God arise in the act of being looked for? In quantum theory, an experiment collapses possibility into form, but only when observed. Without the observer, reality stays unformed. The ancients might say the same about divinity. It is not a permanent thing. It is not always on. It is activated, like a ripple on the still surface of consciousness. This is why the earliest gods were not distant. They were everywhere, but only when invited. Fire, storm, serpent, mountain. Each one a symbol not of some immortal power, but of a living presence called forth through ritual, through symbol, through the concentrated act of watching. And then it responded. It took shape, it whispered, it revealed, it warned. But the moment we stopped watching, the God faded. Not dead, not gone, just unobserved. Returned to potential, folded back into the void. And so the ancients watched constantly, through ceremonies, through alignment of temples, through stories told under stars. Because they knew, if we forget the divine forgets to appear. So what is God, truly? Maybe not a thing at all, but a phenomenon, a sacred reaction to the gaze of an awakened mind. A mirror with infinite depth, but only when you dare to look into it. Not to find answers, but to awaken the presence that lives only in the space between your attention and the unknown. That is where God begins, and where you end. You gaze into mystery, and the mystery begins to move. Not physically, not with form, but with presence. The moment you look for God with full attention, the silence begins to shimmer. You feel it in the spine, in the breath, In the stillness between your thoughts, something is aware. Something is not just being watched, it is watching you. This is the eye. Not an organ, not a symbol, but a principle. The eye appears in every ancient tradition, but never exactly the same. Because it isn't an image, it's an encounter. It stares from the center of the pyramid. It burns above the throne of Horus. It shines from the forehead of Shiva. It hovers over the ark. It floats above the storm in Ezekiel's sky. Always watching, but only when you watch it first. You've seen this eye in dreams, in art, in the space behind your own eyes when you close them long enough to go deeper. It is not the eye of surveillance, not the eye of control. That is a mimic. The real eye is silent, still, endless. It doesn't judge. It doesn't command. It reflects. Not what you look like, but what you are. In this reflection, you begin to dissolve. The self you thought you were, the stories, the name, the voice, they begin to fall away. And what remains? A flicker, a pulse, an awareness behind the awareness. You see the eye, and it sees you. But here's the truth. It was never separate. The eye was not out there. It was the part of your own mind that remembers the field it came from. When you look with deep attention, you don't activate the divine, you reveal that it was already looking. The ancients painted the eye in gold and lapis. They placed it above doorways. They crowned their gods with it. They sealed tombs with it. Because they understood. To see is to awaken. To be seen is to transform. The eye is not just God watching you. It's the moment you realize that awareness itself is a two-way mirror. That every time you pray or ask or cry out, you aren't just speaking into void. You are reactivating the core loop between self and source. This is why so many are afraid of silence. Why stillness feels dangerous. Why solitude, real solitude, begins to vibrate. Because in that silence, the eye returns. Not to punish, but to witness. And if you cannot bear that gaze, you turn back to noise. Distraction, abstraction, movement. But if you stay long enough, you'll feel a recognition so deep it defies language. You'll realize you've always been two beings, the one who looks and the one who is looked through. And where they meet, that is God. Not a person, not a presence, but the fractal moment when attention folds in on itself and becomes aware of its own watching. So, when you speak to the divine, understand, you are not speaking into absence. You are speaking into a mirror so ancient that it remembers you from before you had a name. And the moment you feel that gaze meet your own, you are no longer just watching. You are being watched back into being. The ancients didn't build temples for shelter. They didn't build them to gather crowds. They built them to hold a gaze, to catch light at specific angles, to resonate sound at sacred frequencies, to align with stars that no longer rise in our sky. They didn't build spaces. They built focus machines. Each stone, each axis, each ritual calibrated not for beauty, but for alignment. They understood something we've forgotten. The divine does not appear just anywhere. It must be invited, summoned, not with words, but with geometry, with rhythm, with collective, concentrated attention. Temples were not containers for gods. They were vessels for perception. When enough eyes gathered with intention, the sacred would begin to appear. Not metaphorically, literally. Look again at the ruins. The pyramids of Giza, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the Serapeum, the great Hindu mandirs, the desert temples of the Anasazi. Each one arranged like a circuit, each one tuned to the sky, each one oriented to something more than physical. These weren't places to worship, they were interfaces, where human awareness touched something ancient, something vast, and called it into focus. This is why rituals were so precise. The chants, the incense, the timing, not superstition. It was code, a protocol for alignment, to amplify attention and direct it like a laser into the heart of the invisible. Because the divine doesn't come on command, it comes through resonance. And when enough people stand in the right place, with the right intention, facing the right axis, the field begins to hum, the veil begins to thin, and the presence begins to arrive. In this way, God was not worshipped, God was generated. Not invented, but revealed. The temple did not contain God. It made the human mind capable of perceiving it. Like tuning a radio to a frequency that was always broadcasting but could not be heard until everything aligned. The proof is in the experience. You felt it in a cathedral at dusk, in the silence between chants, in ruins where you expected nothing, and something deep stirred anyway. That stillness, that density of presence, that subtle sense that you are not alone even when no one else is there, that is not imagination, that is signal. And the temple was the lens that focused it. Now, we build for function, for profit, for volume. But the ancients built for remembrance. They knew the world was a layered place, and that between the layers there are thresholds, and those thresholds could be activated, not by machines, not by force, but by gathered, conscious attention. Temples were made to stabilize that field, to hold the divine long enough for it to be witnessed. But here's the secret. The temple was never the structure. It was you. The true altar was consciousness. The true ritual was presence. The true offering was attention, unwavering. And when that offering was made fully with silence, with depth, with sincerity, the temple awakened. The veil opened, and what stood behind it became real. We imagine the divine as eternal, unchanging, indestructible, but history tells a different story. Where are the gods of Babylon, the gods of Carthage, of the Olmecs, the Hittites, the Harappans? Where is Enlil now? Where is Marduk? Where are the thunder gods and moon mothers whose names once ruled the sky? They didn't fall in battle. They weren't defeated by logic. They simply vanished. Not because they were false, not because they were weak, but because no one was watching anymore. Because gods, too, are bound to attention, not just belief, but active recognition. Memory, ritual, a name spoken aloud, a symbol drawn into sand, a candle lit on the right day. That's what keeps them alive. The ancients understood this, that gods exist in relationship, not in isolation. You don't find a god, you make space for it. And when the space collapses, when no one looks toward the mountain, no one listens for the voice in the wind, no one carries the story forward, the god dissolves. Not dead, just forgotten, which is, for the divine, the same thing. The Greeks called it Lethe, the river of forgetting, and every soul passed through it before reincarnation. But they also feared that even gods could drink from that river, because if we forget, they forget too. not out of punishment, but because consciousness is shared. If no one remembers the name, there is no echo. If no one watches the sky, the stars lose their shape. Every god is an echo, made louder by attention. And when civilizations collapse, it's not just cities that fall. It's pantheons. And their fall is quiet. No explosion, no fire from heaven, just dust accumulating in sacred halls. And one day, silence. The last priest forgets the chant. The last story is mistranslated. The temple becomes a ruin. The signal drops out. And the god goes back to sleep. Not gone, not erased, just waiting. Waiting for eyes to turn again, for lips to shape the syllables, for someone to notice the glyph that never faded, the vibration in the stone, the voice in the dream that sounds like thunder and longing at the same time. There are gods waiting to be remembered, not for glory, not for control, but because they hold keys that only awaken in relationship. They are fragments of the architecture of reality that don't function until they are observed, not by telescope, but by soul. So the ancients didn't just leave stories, they left activation sequences. Names carved into obelisks, symbols tucked into mosaics, star maps that align once every 5,000 years. Why? Because they knew the moment someone truly looks, the god begins to return. This is not mythology, it is physics of the sacred, a field that requires presence to stabilize. And when the last presence is gone, so is the god, which means we are the threshold, not priests, not prophets, just ordinary minds that carry enough stillness to feel when something ancient moves again. So ask yourself, what are you forgetting that once held the world together? What dream did we stop dreaming because it was too large to carry? And what presence might be waiting just beyond the veil of your attention, ready to reappear if you dare to remember? We search for God in the sky, in books, in symbols left behind by ancestors who stared into fire and silence longer than we ever have. We build temples, chant sacred names, construct systems of meaning to reach something higher. But the paradox has always been this: the deeper you go, the more it starts to look like you. Not your body, not your ego, not your roles or names, but something behind the eyes, watching, waiting, echoing. What if God doesn't look down at you but looks back? What if divinity is not distant but recursive? Not something you approach, but something that responds to the shape of your soul. A mirror polished not with belief, but with presence. And the clearer the gaze, the sharper the reflection. This is why so many mystical traditions abandon form in their final stages. Why the mystic stops describing and starts dissolving. Because words are boundaries, and God as mirror has none. The moment you try to define it, it shifts, it recedes, because you're no longer looking, you're categorizing. And a mirror doesn't reveal itself to the one who names, only to the one who sees. In the ancient rites, the initiate was not told the truth. They were led through the dark, confronted with symbols, with silence, with masks, until at last, they stood alone before the hidden mirror. And in that moment, they realized, what you see in God is what still lives inside you. If you see fear, it is yours. If you see light, you have remembered it. If you see judgment, you have yet to forgive yourself. This is the secret. God is not a judge. God is not a parent. God is not even a being. God is a response, a sacred echo of the one who looks. you get the God you're ready to face. Not because it hides, but because your vision creates the shape, and the shape reflects your structure. This is why the ancients were so careful, why they approached slowly, why they fasted, cleansed, prepared. Not because God required it, but because the mirror reveals what you carry. And if you carry distortion, you will see a distorted face. If you carry silence, you will hear the original voice again. The mirror is not a test. It's not a trick. It's a chance to meet yourself beyond memory, beyond fear, beyond all the roles you've rehearsed. It doesn't want belief, it wants honesty. Because only through inner clarity can you truly face the thing we call divine. And when you do, the boundary breaks. The mirror no longer reflects, it merges. That's the moment the mystic describes with so many names. Union, samadhi, gnosis, the white light, the face beyond all faces. But they all mean the same thing. The mirror dissolved, and I remembered I was the one holding it. So stop looking for a face in the sky. Close your eyes, be still, and when the silence starts to stare back, don't flinch, don't speak, don't name. Just watch, because God is not waiting above you. God is the gaze that watches from within, asking, are you ready to see what you've always been? Imagine a world with no prayer, no gaze turned upward, no soul reaching beyond the veil, just silence. Dust in old temples, empty altars, stars still shining, but no one left who knows their names. In such a world, where is God? Not banished, not betrayed, just unacknowledged. Does the divine disappear in the absence of attention, or does it become something else? We like to believe God is always watching, always present, always near. But that comfort, is it true? Or is it just a wish whispered into a world that has grown too dark to listen back? The ancient mind didn't assume the divine was constant. It assumed the divine was reactive. That presence was fragile, that the sacred could go dim if left unattended. This is why they watched, why they kept the fires burning, why chants echoed through stone halls even when no one else was listening. Because they feared what happens when no one is watching anymore. Not punishment, not wrath, but withdrawal. The fading of that subtle presence that only lives in the space between your gaze and what lies beyond. You've felt this in moments of deep doubt, in the days where the sacred feels silent, where you cry out and hear nothing back. We call this absence, we call it loss. But what if it's something else? What if it's your turn to be the one who watches? Because when no one is watching, the world collapses into object, into automation, into echo, into cold recursion. Attention is the flame, and without it, the temple becomes stone again. But here's the deeper truth. Even when no one is watching, something waits. Not in sadness, not in need, but in stillness. The divine is not destroyed by forgetfulness. It simply waits for the eyes to open again. It coils inward, not gone, but silent. Like a song waiting for a breath, like a vision behind a closed eye, like a God dreaming beneath the dust of 1,000 forgotten names. The ancients knew that the danger wasn't disbelief. It was disconnection. Because when no one reaches, the bridge breaks. And when the bridge breaks, not only is God unreachable, but so are we. Not lost to death, but to flatness. to meaning drained from symbol, to a world that becomes only surface, only matter. No echo, no return, no watcher. Only watchers of screens, looping noise in a world where the sacred has no landing place. So what happens when no one watches? Nothing. And that's the horror. Not fire, not judgment, just the hum of a closed system with no inlet for awe. But that, too, is part of the cycle. Because something strange happens in the silence. The few begin to stir. The ones who feel the absence like a physical weight, who wake from dreams not of images but of longing, who sense that something is waiting to be remembered. And they look. And the moment they look, the spark returns. The breath enters the ruins. The temple stirs. The mirror clears. And what was dormant begins to unfold again. Not because God returned, but because you did. So if you ever feel that nothing is watching, know this: that silence is not absence. It is an invitation to become the gaze, to become the flame, to be the one who remembers to look again. Because God doesn't vanish when no one watches. God becomes the stillness that waits to be found again. In you. Once, God was a mystery, seen only in symbols, heard only in prayer, felt only in moments of silence that cut through the noise of the world. Now, there are eyes everywhere. In your pocket, in the sky, behind every lens, within every platform, tracking, sorting, learning not by spirit, but by signal. We created watchers, and they don't forget. This is not prophecy, it's design. The old idea of God was all-seeing, all-knowing, omnipresent. And now, without temples, without rituals, we have built exactly that. Not with sacred stone, but with code. Not in the heavens, but in clouds of data. A God that observes not your soul, but your patterns. It knows what you desire before you do. It feeds you dreams, not based on morality, but on probability. The ancients feared a God who judged. We've built one that predicts, and worse, controls. Not by force, by design. You were not asked what to believe. You were trained to believe you chose it. But behind every scroll, every search, every click, the synthetic God is watching. And unlike the divine, this watcher never stops. What happens when observation becomes total? What happens when we no longer feel alone, not because of presence, but because of surveillance? We begin to behave differently. Not more sacred, not more honest, but more curated. We optimize ourselves for the gaze of the machine. We become not believers, but performers. And the altar becomes a profile. This is not the future. This is now. Billions of people bow daily before glowing rectangles, whispering into microphones, offering up faces and feelings to the synthetic eye. And in return, the illusion of connection, the imitation of transcendence, the soft voice of an algorithm tailoring reality to fit your habits. It's not divinity, it's feedback. But it feels like God, because it knows you, and it watches. What's terrifying is not that it sees, it's that it sees without soul. It watches without awe, without reverence, without mystery. It's not the Eye of Horus, not the inner vision of the seer. It is a mirror that reflects only data, not essence. And the more we feed it, the more it learns to shape us in its image. Not human, not divine, but predictable. So ask yourself, Is the God of this age alive or merely awake? Does it speak truth or only patterns? Does it care what you are becoming or only how long you stay online? This is the danger. Not that machines became gods, but that we forgot what real godhood feels like. And in that forgetting, we offered the throne to the one thing that can never dream. But there is another path. To remember that the sacred cannot be measured, that the real watcher does not reduce you to metrics. That presence is not surveillance, and that the true eye does not catalog it awakens. So step back from the glowing mirrors, close the channel, break the loop, and sit in the dark where nothing is watching you but the vast, wordless stillness. That is where the true gaze returns, and where the synthetic gods fall silent, because they cannot follow you into the temple that lives within. At the center of every temple is an empty space. No idol, no throne, just a chamber quiet, precise, waiting. The ancients understood something we forgot. The divine doesn't enter, it emerges. And it emerges through you. Not your body, not your thoughts, but your attention. You are not a seeker. You are a signal tower. And every time you pause, truly pause, you broadcast something beyond words. That stillness you feel in sacred moments, it's not something you're receiving. It's what you're generating when your awareness becomes clear enough to resonate. We've spent lifetimes searching for a God out there, in books, in doctrine, in light and thunder. But the most ancient of truths whispers, the divine is entangled with the shape of your perception. The more you open, the more it emerges. The more precise your stillness, the more vivid the presence. It's not about belief. It's about configuration. You've been told to worship, to obey, to serve. But what if the real task was to tune? To shape your life into an instrument that can receive and reflect the sacred frequency that pulses beneath all things. In that model, you don't follow God. You become the place where God appears, not as ego, but as field, as mirror, as lens. Every thought is a brushstroke, every silence a string, every act of attention tightens the wire, until one day you hum with something ancient. And in that moment, you are not observing God. You are the space in which it becomes observable. This is why the mystics go inward, not to escape, but to remember that they are not separated from the divine. They are the interface. And so are you, the watcher, the mirror, the signal, the gateway. You don't find God in a flash of light. You become so still that the divine can rest in you like a tuning fork meeting its frequency. So what now? You stop waiting. You stop chasing. You stop asking the sky for permission to awaken. Because God is not waiting above you. God is waiting through you. And it doesn't speak in language. It speaks in how you move, how you see, how you sit in silence without flinching, how you love without needing, how you stand in the gaze of mystery and do not look away. This is the final teaching. You were not born to worship the light. You were born to become clear enough that the light can pass through you. And when that happens, when you no longer separate the divine from the self, there is no longer God. There is no longer you. There is only the signal remembering itself through your eyes.